So any talk here? Is there? Good morning, madam. I wish you all the best in the work that is ahead of you.
His Grace Archbishop the organizers of today's event, members of civil society, development agencies, representatives of the Archdiocese Fijian Minister, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to be with you here this morning, as we gather to open our first regional workshop addressing domestic violence and gender justice during COVID-19. My hearty thanks to the Catholic Church for inviting me to be part of this very important event. And I take this time to convey my heartfelt congratulations to the Women's Ministry of the Caritas Fiji for having achieved this milestone of organizing a workshop that I'm very pleased. The agenda of the workshop is something that is very close to where I serve, and is indeed one of the most important priority areas in human development overall. As COVID-19 grips the world, market economies shutting down, schools have been closed, nearly half of the global population have been or are still confined to their homes. For Fiji, the experience was the same, and while today we are a success story of how we managed the spread of the virus in the country, the unprecedented implications of COVID-19 on our lives and our economy and people remains, and is likely to continue for a very long time. The COVID-19 crisis is indeed a systemic human development crisis, compounding risks to progress towards gender equality. While the COVID-19 crisis affects everyone, women and girls face specific and often disproportionate economic, health, and social risks due to deeply entrenched inequalities, social norms, and unequal power relations. Understanding the gender-differentiated impacts of the COVID-19 crisis is fundamental to designing responses that reduce vulnerable conditions and strengthen women's agency, placing gender equality at the center. This is not just about rectifying long-standing inequalities, but also about building a more just and resilient world. And we are thankful for civil society partners coming on board to do their bit in this area. The immediate effects of COVID-19 on gender inequality are already showing on the burden of unpaid care work and, of course, gender-based violence. The purpose of this workshop, I understand, is to address the current issues of gender justice with specific reference to domestic violence during COVID-19. The issue of gender-based violence in Fiji is already a matter of grave concern for all of us. Our statistics speak for itself. I think we all know the world average of gender violence and domestic violence, 1 in every 3 women in the world suffered some sort of violence in their life. When it comes to our dear country Fiji, it's 2 in every 3 women. At least 72% of Fijian women have suffered some sort of violence during their lifetime. And that's the statistics that drives us here today. And when we talk about domestic violence in the context of COVID-19, it's very telling. Based on the National Domestic Violence Helpline 1560, data for April, there's been a significant increase in calls. We compared data over a 3-month period from pre-COVID to the first month of COVID. 87 calls in February of this year. 187 calls in March when COVID started. In April, 527 genuine calls to the national helpline. 66% of the callers were women, 44% men, 54% of calls were domestic violence related, and 30% related to COVID-19. Close to 50% of women were reporting a correlation between COVID-19 and an increase in violence, linked directly to the restrictions of movement and economic strains on families. The domestic violence being reported was serious. Close to 3/4 of the women that called reported physical violence, including some extremely serious forms of violence, such as being punched, kicked, and hit by stones and timber. Earlier this year, Fiji embarked on a historic mission to develop a national action plan to prevent violence against all women and girls, 2021 to 2026, making it the first Pacific Island country and one of the only 2 countries globally to have a whole-of-government, inclusive, evidence-based approach to prevent violence against all women and girls. Ladies and gentlemen, if we are to analyze our response to domestic violence on a national scale at the moment, you will find that the majority of our efforts is on the after the event. What do we do after violence has started? If we look at the Domestic Violence Act, it talks about restraining orders. It talks about the payment of fund to the victim. We know about the work of non-government organizations in this area, shelters for women. There are a lot of initiatives in place. But when you look at it, majority of these efforts is after the event. So the National Action Plan is an effort to address violence before it starts. How can we stop violence? It's not an easy task to do. It will require not only a whole-of-government approach, but a whole-of-nation approach. And that is where stakeholders such as religious-based organizations come in. That's where individuals come in. Men, women, children, the elderly, community leaders, everybody. We recognize that in order to solve a national problem, there must be an evidence-based as well as a shared understanding amongst us about what causes it. The National Action Plan will explain, using data and evidence, what the root causes of violence are against all women and girls, and what additional contributing factors that makes the violence more likely to happen. Government has established the Domestic Violence Act and reforms in the Crimes Act to better address the gaps in addressing gender-based violence and provides for justice for survivors and rehabilitation and punishment of perpetrators. We all know about the toll-free lines 1560 for domestic violence, 1325 the Child Helpline, managed by non-government organizations and paid for by government, whereby callers are assisted through a referral system for cases of violence and abuse against women and children. I'd like to encourage all Fijians to not turn a blind eye when we see abuse happening. Not ignore such a scenario saying it's a private matter. It is not. Sexual abuse and domestic violence are criminal acts. If you see it happening, intervene. Do something about it. I understand that the target audience today, community members from Catholic faith-based, economical, and interfaith networks, and I cannot emphasize enough how important you are as stakeholders. Violence against women and girls, including sexual offenses, is rooted in gender-based discrimination, social norms, cultural attitudes, and gender stereotypes that perpetuate violence. Therefore, I believe that faith-based organizations are a very key and powerful player in getting the message across, leading a national conversation to influence the public discourse on the root causes and contributing factors of violence against women and girls in Fiji, and a problem that can be prevented, as 84% of the world's population affiliate themselves with a religion, meaning we have the power as individuals, as members of the church, to influence thought processes of our followers, in order for abusive behavior to be eradicated from our society. To combat violence against women and girls and children, we need to take ownership of it. I think there's been enough acknowledgement of how big this problem is. We have the data already, and usually when we're talking about changing mindsets, when we're talking about policy reforms, it's data that we look for, so that when we are formulating the response, it is a targeted response. A response that can actually be effective and makes a difference in the social ill that we're trying to combat. Here we have the data. We have the conversations going. It's about taking ownership of it. And this example right here today, having this workshop, and the aim to set up support groups after this, when you leave this workshop, that's taking ownership. That's taking ownership of it. I've said I would like to reiterate being the platform for the National Action Plan, the changing of mindsets. As attendees at this workshop, I can see we of different age groups, whatever age group that you belong to, whatever area or sector that you're serving in your communities, you're taking ownership of this can make a change in the communities that you live in. Setting up the support groups will show the women, survivors, the girls, the children that get abused in your communities that yes, somebody is doing something about this and I got to do my part and come forward and talk about it. So it's an obligation. It's not just a workshop. This is a great honor, I must say. You've been picked for some reason to be here in this room today. The organizers of this event have identified you for some special reason. That special reason must show after this workshop when you're setting up your support groups and lending the required support to survivors and victims after family violence. There's no doubt that the action to stop violence against women and girls must start now, must be taken now, and it must happen in full force and through every possible avenue. The numerous tragedies of Fijian women losing their lives at the hands of men who promised to love them reminds us time and again that we must keep working together to change our culture and attitudes that are embedded in male power and control over women, gender inequality, gender discrimination, and patriarchy. Government will keep working with all relevant stakeholders towards a society free from violence. I emphasize that violence against women, girls, and children is preventable, and you are part of that answer. We all shall and can play our part. Violence against women and girls starts with disrespectful behavior and discriminatory attitudes, and we have to change that by recognizing, calling out, and preventing these attitudes. We can all play a role in stopping it before it starts. With these words, I'd like to now declare the Caritas Archdiocese Women's Ministries workshop addressing domestic violence and gender justice during COVID-19 officially open.